Howdy howdy y'all, welcome back to Luke's Homebrew. Today we are doing 10 tips to make you a better dungeon master. And hopefully these help. These are all tips that I have learned through my 4 consecutive multi-year long campaigns. So let's get right into it because that's really what you care about. So tip number 1, check online. Thank you for clicking on this video. Hopefully you learned something. But D&D has become such a phenomenon lately that almost anything that you need or could want is found online. Whether it be dice, minis, dungeons, homebrew classes, standard vanilla classes, beta test stuff from Unearthed Arcana. Anything that you or your players could find, or maybe you want to surprise your players, and this is something that you really want to use to spice up the game that they've never seen, well, check online. There's millions of stuff. I check DM's Guild every single day, and there is at least 2 to 5 brand new classes or sets of rules that come out every single day. So that's number 1 on the list, is you really want to check online. And you've already made the first step by clicking on this video. Now, let's move on. Tip number 2. Mini setup. Come on, man, set up the Dwarven Forge beforehand. I'm guilty of this problem too, but because every now and then players will go off and kind of do their own thing and then get into combat because they stirred up some trouble, and then, well, now you're caught with a whole bunch of Dwarven Forge in your back cabinet, but then no map to put in front of the players. So now you're spending the next 5 to 10 minutes with them all on their phones disconnecting from you, and you are setting up Dwarven Forge. In that specific niche of a situation, what you can do is actually have your players help you build the setting, especially if it's improvised. But if it's not, please, as both a player and a dungeon master, please set up the Dwarven Forge beforehand. It takes 5 to 10 minutes per encounter. You should have about 2 to 3 combat encounters per dungeon crawl. Per session if it's fairly long. If it's a very short encounter, maybe even just do it Theater of the Mind, save yourself some trouble and some money, buy in Dwarven Forge. And that's a note too. You do not need Dwarven Forge. I like my Dwarven Forge, but I find that I typically use my wooden blocks that I had when I was in 1st grade a lot more often than I do my Dwarven Forge. And it hurts me just a little bit knowing how much money I spent. But I kind of like the wooden blocks better. But you can use cardboard, you can use Legos, whatever you've got, just set it up beforehand. Your players will appreciate you, and the immersion is immense. Alright. Howdy y'all. Welcome back to Luke's Homebrew. I just wanted to give a quick shout out to my friend Billy over at Creative Boundaries on Instagram. He just made this awesome map for me. I'm make it full frame so that way you guys can see it, because that's more important than my ugly mug. I just want to give him a huge shout out. He's doing commissions on Fiverr. You can also contact him on Instagram. The link down to his account will be in the doobly-doo. He does really fantastic work. This is for my own personal campaign. So if you're interested in looking for a map for your own campaign, or maybe for your own fantasy setting, or just want some cool art piece in the background when you're streaming, please check him out. He's doing I forgot the word. Commissions, that's the word. Alright, thank you very much for listening, and let's get back to the video. Let's move on to tip number 3. Painting minis. It's really simple. You don't need to. Your players appreciate you just buying the mini. Whether they say it or not, they really appreciate that 3D model where they can actually pinpoint, that is the monster, that is the troll, that is the dragon. Now, if you can't get it painted, obviously, more the merrier, better is better, but don't stress like you need to, because you really don't. And really, all I do for my players is typically the first couple sessions I'll give them the blank mini, mostly because I don't have time to paint it myself, or my painter just is so stocked up with other minis that I'm having her paint that she just can't get to it in time, and that's okay. Don't stress about it. But let's move on to tip number 4. And this is a tip that I struggle with time to time, mainly because I'm crunched on time and I hate repetitiveness. But please draw 2 dungeon maps. one for you. One is the Dungeon Master. It tells you where all the monster encounters are, where all the traps are, how to do all that, what's in the treasure chest and the far side of the dungeon that players are probably not going to get to. And then one for your players that's completely blank. And whether you do like strips of tape along long corridors, however you want to do it, maybe build it all in Dwarven Forge and put paper on top of it. However you do it, make sure that there's 2 dungeons. And this is going to lead into the next tip, but really it's so that they can stay immersed and both you and your players can be on the same page. Because especially in like mega dungeon crawls and dungeon crawls, that seems to be the biggest disconnect, especially in our super short attention span, range of players that we have coming in, and just this whole generation. We're all turning into 5-second attention span little creatures. And if the DM says there's a left-hand turn, 5 seconds later, well, what left-hand turn? You know what I mean? So having the 2 maps really eases that disconnect between you and your players, because you as the Dungeon Master, you see it. You have the map right in front of you, and it's very easy to forget that they don't have the same mental image that you do. But let's move on to tip number 5, which kind of follows that one very closely, is when you're making descriptions, especially when your players enter a room or a new scene, be very short and concise. Only say the important details that really are going to lead to areas that you have prepped. Now, say you don't have very much prepped. Be prepared to go on your heels as soon as you say something that isn't written down on paper. If they decide to look at the bookshelf because you said there was a bookshelf in the Wizard's Tower, and you start naming off book names, be prepared to back up each and every name that you say. And by doing that, or to be able to do that, because obviously you're not going to be able to read a 300-page book in a Wizard's Tower to them, that would be boring and stupid. No, what you should do is keep the title short and concise. An author would do that too. And by making that title very short and concise and just very key words, you can kind of peel back on that and all your lore that you have built up, at least in your mind, if not written down, to be able to give your players that and give them the immersion that, oh, he actually prepped for me to find this book? You absolutely didn't, but maybe they think that. And the other tip to that is just don't tell them that you told them, or that you came up with it out of your ass. But be very short and concise with your descriptions. If you describe too much, then your players are going to get lost in the sea of knowledge that you just gave to them. Just give them key points, and if they really start delving into it, then maybe ease up or open up some details and really let them explore and flesh that out. But just give them key details to kind of feel around and see what they want to do and what they want to explore. But let's move on to tip number 6. I think I've talked about number 5 long enough. So, number 6 is homebrew. Just be yourself. The book isn't the law. I've rearranged dungeons in books. For example, like the Tomb of Horrors, I have completely messed that up so bad. I have run a game where the initial hallway, I completely mixed up with a different hallway and ran them through that, and it didn't end so well. But that is just the essence of the game. You, the DM, are not going to be perfect, so it's okay to kind of go on your heels and really just like blend everything in. If you mess up and mix up 2 rooms that you had prepared in a dungeon, it's okay. Just stick with it. Don't go back on yourself. That confidence to just stick with your mistake is everything when being a dungeon master. Because if you can just make a mistake and then kind of brush it off like nothing happened, that way your players can't tell, then they have no idea that you made a mistake. And honestly, that was the biggest key words of advice that was given to me when I started DMing. And ever since then, it has guided me throughout my multi-year campaigns. So I really stress it, and I hope you guys latch onto it just like I did. But let's move on to number 7. These next couple are very player-based. So number 7 is know your players. Randoms can be like a public match in Modern Warfare 2, for those that get that reference, with mics with no filter and they're complete trolls. You want to know who you're inviting to the game. And yeah, I'm not saying that Adventure League and inviting someone's cousin over for a one-shot is a bad idea. Absolutely, get more people into the game. That's kind of partly our job as Dungeon Masters, is to really extend the lifespan of the game and really get more people into it, because it's a fantastic hobby. But be careful. Read them. Kind of figure out who they are before you invite them to the game. Are they going to mess up any group dynamics that you have with other party members? Like, really pay attention to who you're inviting to the table. Because one bad player can show up and piss off 2 or 3 of your really loyal and dedicated players, and maybe they just don't care as much anymore. Then they stop picking up on leads and hooks that you have put ahead because they're upset and they don't care. And you're putting up with Joe Schmo who's there. So really just know who you're inviting, and we'll get back to situations like that in a little bit. But number 8 is be upfront with your players. If you are, for example, going to be late to a session, tell your players as soon as possible. And that will encourage them to do the same for you. But that also has a double meaning as well. Don't surprise your players in-game with inconveniences for the sake of suspense. Transparency about delicate matters is a lot better. So if you have a warlock and you have big plans for their patron, and they have an idea of one thing and you're planning on flipping the script on them and throwing out the rug, well, do you know how they're going to respond to that? Do you know if they're just going to say, you know what, F you. I wanted to play a warlock and I wanted this neat dynamic between me and you, and now you just threw out my warlock and you want me to be a cleric. That kind of ruins my plans. That ruins my fun. So just be careful with that. Be very upfront and be like, hey man, I see that you have a celestial warlock. I really like him, but I think it'd be super cool if he started taking some levels in cleric. You don't have to, but here's my reasoning why, and I think it'd be a very cool story element. That's something you can bring up, and maybe you can convince the player otherwise. But don't get upset if they say no still, because at the end of the day, they are the player. You get to control the rest of the world, but their character is the only thing that they get to control. Let's move on to number 9. Don't be afraid to kick out a player. Even your best friends can really kill the groove at the table. If you have a groove set, don't be afraid to tell interested players no. It's okay to tell new people no. And I did say a couple minutes ago, try and get as many people into the game as possible. It's part of your job. But also don't ruin your game for the sake of that. There's thousands of games out there. Hundreds and hundreds of other dungeon masters that'd be more than happy to pick up a new player. But if your table is perfect, you all have a groove, everyone shows up on time, we all stay late because we're all having such a great time, maybe introducing that new person, they could be a Modern Warfare 2 troll that ruins the game. So really weigh whether or not it's worth taking the risk. But if you have made that mistake and they are turning out to be a troll, don't be afraid to kick them out. It is better for everyone to get them out of that and get that toxic person out of the game than to put up with it, because it's going to make you stop caring about the game. It's going to make you start thinking about other things and I have to run the game for that person again. Then the players that are still invested start suffering because you're pissed off, they get pissed off, and no one's happy. So it's easier to get the short and ugly out of the way and continue with the game, and hopefully everything settles back down to normal. But rounding this out, tip number 10, and I hope these are all helpful, but Reddit is not always the answer. You and the table are the answer. Alright? If there's ever a disagreement at the table, always, always, always favor the table over your own pride. It is better to have a happy group than a miserable session. But keep it within reason. And note, when players are respecting the narrative and your unwritten rules versus when they're not, and what players are doing that. Because if you have a player that you tell everyone at session 0, hey, I'm not planning on starting any fights, I'm going to typically favor you guys, but just see if anyone is really trying to take advantage of that. Because if they are, they're probably a really toxic player. But if players are respecting that and y'all are having a good time, it is so much easier to end a fight before it starts by just being like, all right, you guys go ahead and you can do that, no worries. Then getting into a fight, bogging down the game for 10 minutes, then everyone's all bent out of shape or on their phones and no longer paying attention. So it's almost always to favor what the table believes versus what you believe. Even if they're wrong and you're right, or vice versa, it's about keeping a happy table. But don't let them walk all over you. But I hope that's really fills everything out and answers any questions you have. Those were 10 tips on being a better dungeon master, mostly directed towards D&D 5th edition, but I think most can be attributed to any edition or any game, whether it be Starfinder, Pathfinder, the like. But if you did enjoy the video, please leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. It really helps the channel grow. And if you're interested in more content like this, I have an account on DM's Guild. The link should be in the doobly-doo, so just go ahead and click it out if you're interested and you want to support the channel. Thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you next time. Bye.